Welcome to the course Culturally Responsive Built Environments. In this lecture, we are going to talk about the cultural planning approaches. In fact, it gives you a brief introduction of cultural planning and how it has been taught in different parts of the world. Before talking about cultural planning, because in this whole course we are talking about culturally responsive built environments, and in fact our course has started with the need to understand culture and how it is having direct and indirect implications in shaping our built environments. So in fact, the process of integration of culture, in the last class we have discussed about the Hridaya city plan and so how the local development plans also try to identify and try to integrate the culture. That is the biggest challenge. So prior to the cultural planning approaches, I want to bring some kind of understanding on the UNESCO's efforts. In fact, the UNESCO Universal Declaration on Cultural Diversity, it's a document for the World Summit on Sustainable Development, which was held in 2002 in Johannesburg. So it actually talks about the vision, the conceptual platform, the pool of ideas for implementation, and a new paradigm. So in fact, the summarized version of it, it actually takes the discussion of cultural diversity to the level of common heritage of humanity. In fact, it is not about a region specific or a place specific, but how we share, how we are unique by our heritage, and how this diversity has to be addressed. And that is where we are talking about the common heritage of humanity. So it touches upon various significant aspects. The first thing which talks about the identity, diversity, and pluralism. So it sets up a few articles. I've just briefly explained you. So as I discussed with you, how to take this cultural diversity as a common heritage of humanity. And the article 2 talks about from cultural diversity to cultural pluralism. So it also talks about the individual's identities and how the individual perceptions towards the heritage and the cultural values have to be also considered. Article 3 talks about the cultural diversity as a factor in development, because before 1950s and 60s, so the culture has not been much emphasized in the development agendas, because mostly on an economic agendas or a scientific, and the development agendas are very much focused on the social, economic, and some of the drivers which have led the development. But now, because they might have targeted on a particular specific community, specific goals, specific infrastructural achievements, but how about in a cities like where the multicultural behaviors, where people from different places, especially of the post-World War, many migrations do take place and people started settling down, and countries like London, the post-industrialization, how different communities have started settling down and expanding the peripheries of the big cities, and how there's always a conflict of multicultural behaviors and what kind of values they are associated with. So these are all some of the questions. So how we have to consider these kind of skills and the diversity within the communities, and how that could be a factor within the development. And it also can talk about the local economies. The second component which they talk about is the cultural diversity and the human rights. So the cultural diversity is very much associated with the human rights. In fact, how the human right, because the access, the right, it talks about the access to a particular place or a particular procedure, a process of it. So human rights as guarantees of cultural diversity. So that is where we talk about the racism, the integration of various communities, so how it can promote access, and how it has right to culture. So Article 5 talks about cultural rights as an enabling environment for cultural diversity. So how the cultural rights can act as an enabling environment for cultural diversity. Whereas Article 6 towards access for all to cultural diversity. So access to all, here all, it is pointing out not only of a differently abled people, but it also talks about the socially segregated communities. It also talks about the economically varied communities. So how a culture is accessible to all. And so in that way, we are addressing the diversity, not only in an individual perception level, but in a holistically from the societal and the communal levels. Then the third aspect which this particular convention talks about is the cultural diversity and creativity. Cultural heritage as the wellspring of creativity, because our culture, which has an embodied creative knowledge, creative skills and development. So how we can actually tap this particular creativity within individuals, within the communities, within a particular trade, within a particular skill. And the Article 8 talks about the production and the services, which talks about the cultural goods and services, commodities of a unique kind. In fact, for example, I'm talking about in the Greek part of Cyprus, where there's a place called Lefkara, which is known for its lace making and the embroidery work. So which means a traditional skill and which is producing that particular products. So the place is known for its unique products and goods and the service delivery. Sometimes even a place is known for its cuisine, and a place is known for its the natural heritage. And so we are talking about what kind of goods it will deliver and which is known for its particular place. Article 9, cultural policies as catalyst of the creativity. So here, what kind of policies that encourages these development of these skills, and as well as the creative skills and the knowledge and the particular products. So how, because that is a bigger level of thinking, and how it constrains and how it enables. So that is where the policy level is also an important aspect. And the last aspect which it talks about is the cultural diversity and international solidarity. So it's not only about what can happen within the boundary, but how it can happen across the boundary. Strengthening capacities for creation and dissemination worldwide. Today, with the digital technologies, someone in the US can know what is happening in Chanderi because of the digital tools and the technology. So the dissemination process has reached from a small room to the whole continent, and it crossed seas and flight skies. Building partnerships between the public sector, the private sector, and the civil society. So how these kind of international trade routes have developed, especially in the digital era, and how we can establish some partnerships between, because obviously when we talk about cultural goods of a particular place, it talks about certain creativity, certain skills, and it is talking about an identity of the people. So how these have to be tagged, and how each sector has a role in the whole supply chain management process. And that is where the international community has to cooperate and participate. And the last aspect within this solidarity, and it talks about the role of UNESCO, because by virtue of its mandate and functions, it has three primary responsibilities. One is to promote the incorporation of the principles set out in the present declaration into the development strategies. So it talks about drawn up within the various intergovernmental bodies. And then it also serves as a reference point and forum where states, international governmental and non-governmental organizations, civil society and the private sector may join together. So we need a platform for all these bodies to come together. And elaborating concepts, objectives, policies in favor of cultural diversity. Pursue its activities in standard setting, awareness raising and capacity building in the areas related to the present declaration within its fields of competence. So it becomes a kind of comparable standard as well. Facilitate the implementation of the action plan, the main lines of which are open. So basically, what are the action plans? So there are a few, this particular committee has drafted a few main lines of an action for the implementation of the UNESCO Universal Declaration on Cultural Diversity. So I just go through a few of these lines. So it talks about advancing in the definition of principles, standards and practices, both the national and international levels, as well as the awareness raising modalities. So how we can raise awareness in these indigenous and the cultural setups. At the same time, it should be also talk about the safeguarding and promotion of cultural diversity and fostering the exchange of knowledge and best practices in regard to cultural pluralism, with a view to facilitating a diversified societies, the inclusion and participation of persons and groups from varied cultural backgrounds. So like that, like for instance, they also talked about safeguarding the linguistic heritage of humanity. So how, with the kind of globalized pressures and with the improved educational systems, so how the local skills and the local language are gradually disappearing. So how we can safeguard these linguistic heritages, because each language have its roots, and it has also in many cases, like in the case of Dogon, they also talked about some directions for the scientific research of the astrophysics. So which means each language has its potential of its poetry, though it is a poetry or it is a kind of scientific writings. So how we can protect them, how we can safeguard them. And we also talk about it also talks about the curriculum design and the teacher education. So see, because when we are talking about culture, the very basic fundamental setup in how we can talk that in our schools, in our colleges. So in order to do that, how we can establish these things in the curriculum set designs. So in fact, even now in Indian curriculum, there have been many debates on what to integrate and what not to integrate. Especially there were different political motives, indirectly or directly. So there's a lot of debate going on, what to integrate and what not to integrate. Again, we talk about how incorporating where appropriate traditional pedagogies into the education process with a view of preserving and making full use of culturally appropriate methods of communication and transmission of knowledge. So we have to rethink about how an appropriate methods of transmission, because it's not about, this is an NPTEL course and you watch from a TV and you learn from it. Maybe the certain skills could be taken on a direct hand-to-hand relationships. Certain skills need a rigorous, a very creative process of learning. So one has to look into those kind of appropriate methods of communication. Like you can't learn the sculpture just by looking at a YouTube channel unless you do it. So that is where you need a studio to do a pottery studio, or so, which means each particular skill needs a different set of requirements. And encouraging the digital literacy and ensuring greater mastery of the new information and communication technologies. Nowadays, we are getting a lot of app-based mobiles, so that, even I remember when I was in Sweden, my daughter used to access the Mahabharata cartoons or the Ramayana cartoons through the digital medias. So in fact, I felt these kind of films, or which are in the digital form media, so they have really served the purpose of communicating the history and the epics of Ramayana and Mahabharata for a small kid. So in that way, these kind of tools has to be envisaged. And promoting linguistic diversity in cyberspace and encouraging universal access through the global network to all information in public domain. So how we can actually provide these linguistic. Now today we are talking about translations, Google Translate and all other things. So in fact, how these vocabularies, how they can be accessed by everyone. In fact, after working in different countries, each country has its own language, but still, because of these tools, one could able to understand the essence of the place and the relevance of the processes. So this is how the digital tools will be of much help. And again, we talk about not only the production of it and the safeguarding and dissemination of diversified contents in the media and global information network. So basically, these are all a very brief of how we can safeguard, how we can disseminate, and how we can produce. So there's a set of action plan which has been set out. In fact, culture, when we talk about culture and cultural diversity, it faces three new challenges. The first, globalization in its powerful expansion of market principles has created new forms of inequality which seem to foster cultural conflict rather than cultural pluralism. Same example I'll give you. Let's say I went in Lefkara in Greek Cyprus. Let's say you have a small piece of embroidery cloth which might have cost 50 pounds. But the same piece which is produced by the Chinese manufacturing, the same piece, it produces, it might have took 5 days to make it, but in one day it can make 100 pieces, and let's say it is sold for 5 pounds. So this has set up a huge demand in the kind of market variances, a tension, because normally a consumer obviously prefer for this, but one has to understand what kind of effort goes on, what kind of skill it goes on, the originality, the authentic skills, and how we value it. So that is how with the globalized, because now globalization brings, location is not a specific aspect. Now it has delocalized the locations. So even from here you can do many things in abroad in any. So in that way, the globalization is one of the biggest challenge in the culture. States which were able to handle the demands of culture and education are increasingly unable to handle on their own the cross-border flow of ideas, images, and resources which affect cultural development. So on one side, for example, when we are talking about the states which were able to handle the demands of culture and education are increasingly unable to handle on their own the cross-border flow of ideas, images, and resources which affect cultural development. Now, a good example of how we accept and how we resist, it's a kind of two-way process, because when there is a system, when there is a process, how a community is sustainably handling their survival strategies and their identity, the ways how they were creating the identity, and when it was able to handle with such indigenous practices and the processes, but now with the increased by the borrowing of various ideas from abroad or the exchange of ideas, when they try to adopt these, and that obviously interfere with these indigenous practices. In many cases, sometimes on the, I would say, it is, people are able to borrow these practices, sometimes blindly, how relevant it is with their cultural system, so the setting. So in fact, this has affected the cultural development. So a good example of, let's say, a carpenter, and a carpenter is teaching the carpentry skills to his the next generations, and now again, when we are the kind of ornamentation, the kind of craftsmanship which it was in the places of Uttarakhand or any other places where the timber is abundant. But now, because of the transfer of various skills which are of a uniform nature, today we hardly find any kind of craftsmen who are making such an ornamentation, because the detail, understanding the detail of it, understanding the local significance of it, so that is becoming very challenging for these particular skills to go to the further generations. So that is where how we borrow the other ideas and how we set up in our system, and that is how it creates the challenges. Like today, everyone is able to, that local skill, everyone is able to afford furniture. They're all ready-made furnitures, but if you look at in many cities where these traditional skills have gradually delineated and then they're deprived, and gradually they're changing their businesses. So there's indirect and indirect impacts. The growing divides in literacy, digital and conventional, have made the renewal of cultural debates and resources an increasingly elite monopoly, diversed from the capabilities and interest of more than half the world's population, who are now in danger of cultural as well as financial exclusion. So I can tell you a good example, especially if you watch the cities from 1990s, when the IT sector came into the cities. And in fact, all because it has created, first of all, an economical divide in the society. And in fact, that time, before 90s, people more or less, they are employed and self-employed, and you have a kind of an established hierarchies. But all of a sudden, the external market have pumped, and then you can see that how people have raised their financial income and how they were able to afford to various foreign goods and services. And like that, many branded companies came into the market, and how they have actually, I mean, how many of them are actually going and having a small tea in the local tea shop? But how about they are going for a kind of coffee day or a branded place? And the consuming perceptions have also changed, and which has actually put in the danger of as well as the financial and exclusion. So here the migration patterns, the exchange of ideas, as we discussed here, there are these brandings, they are becoming a kind of monopoly in the market, and they have certain impacts on the local cultural industries. So when we talk about the cultural planning, it actually emerged around in Europe from 1960s to 1970s, because many of the big cities and the towns, they are facing the drastic changes in their economies and demographics, especially after the Second World War, and how they started stabilizing themselves, and a lot of movements are happening all around the world. And in recognition of both the citizenship and duties, the European Declaration of Urban Rights also included the right to culture, alongside of 19 other environmental rights, and identified the importance how they could be integrated in the urban planning. So the culture, we'll talk about the access to and participation in a wide range of cultural and creative activities and pursuits. Whereas the harmonization of functions where living, working, traveling and pursuit of social activities are as closely interrelated as possible. So from the Cities Institute report, the Cultural Toolkit report, they talked about the chronology of cultural planning. So in fact, in 1900s to 1910s, the paradigm talks about the city as a work of art. In fact, that is how the industrialization process, where the cities like London, they talked about developing various infrastructure related projects, and people migrated from different places, and they started working on these kind of monumental works as well as infrastructure related works. In 1910s to 1915s, which talks about the cultural zoning. So in fact, in the earlier case, we talked about the model of Paris, Vienna city, the beautiful movement, the Ebenezer Howard's Garden City. So that is how the city as work of art. In the cultural zoning, we talk about the civic cultural centers, so which is a social activity for the civic habitants, and the neighborhood facilities, like what kind of access to school, how the Lewis Mumford concept of the neighborhood unit, how people may need not access the school by crossing any highway, city, and the post-war master plans. Similarly, the cultures of communities, where we talk about Jane Jacobs, the community art facilities, the heritage movement, the community development, arts and sports planning, 1970s, the flagship facilities, where the Sydney Opera House and the art centers movement. So basically, these are the flagship events, and then in 1980s and 90s, we talk about the regeneration, especially we talk about the cultural industries, strategies and quarters, festival marketplaces, carnivals, so basically you are talking about how we can regenerate these particular with a set of activities. And in 1990s to 2000s, we are talking about creative cities and the sustainable city. So one of the important people we talk about, Landry and Bianchi, where they call capitals of culture and cultural resources planning, which directly narrows down to the local economic development. And in the 21st century, we are talking about the sustainable communities. So in fact, the housing growth areas, culture and quality of life, livability, happiness indexes. So like that, we are working on this, how the chronology of cultural planning. So I'll just brief you out a few definitions on cultural planning. The cultural planning is an intellectual and professional discipline governing the process of identifying, developing, managing, and exploiting a city's cultural resources. So it involves the process of monitoring and acting upon the economic, cultural, social, educational, environmental, political, and symbolic implications of a city's cultural resources in order to inform policies and strategies. So very briefly, in the cultural planning guidelines of local government, a cultural plan is equal to a cultural framework plus action plan plus budget. So each of them, we need a framework, we need an action plan, and we need a budget, so in order to implement it. So this is how they briefly summarize it. And there's a variety of discussion on how the comprehensive detailed cultural plan, there's various terminologies, how it has been used, comprehensive detailed cultural plan, because this is basically a community-wide plan, and how broadly the defined understanding of culture with integrated goals. It is basically done with the community consultation. Whereas the framework cultural plan, again, it is also through a process of community involvement to produce a framework. So basically, to make a framework, you involve the community, and cultural plan with predominantly single discipline focus. For example, it's an art sector alone. Let's say if we are talking about revitalizing certain art aspect, so on a single focus. And community cultural assessment or cultural mapping. So this is like a comprehensive identification and analysis of communities' cultural resources and needs gathered through a broadly based consultative collaborative process. It is critically early phase of cultural planning. So first we understand what is the need and what are the existing resources and how we act upon it and how we strategically move. So like that, we have a series of specific issue plan, specific district cultural plan, cultural component or municipal or regional general plan, like that, and cultural component of a regional horizontal and vertical form. Here I would like to introduce the Creative Cities Network. So UNESCO have actually started this kind of campaign, sort of how different member states can actually compete and join in this kind of Creative Cities Network, and they have identified certain areas of crafts and folk art, design, film, gastronomy, literature, media arts, and music. And then, in fact, the growth perspective of creative industries as a part of knowledge economies and culture as a key aspect of quality of life and identity. So it talks both as a quality of life and how it portrays the identity. And identity can be both local, cultural, as well as manifested through competitive placemaking and branding. So in fact, we are talking about, let's say, an opera. So how it can also create certain branding to a particular city. Like when we talk about Sydney, we obviously talk about Sydney Opera House. So how certain cultural aspect becomes a branding to those particular cities. So in that, there are a few cities like North Shopping, Tongyang, Jaipur, which is listed in the crafts and folk art, and music and Bologna music. So like that, there's a variety of cities. Like a good example, like in crafts and folk art, you have these of the cities which are mapped, and in the design, a few on the, and in the film, how they are nominated under each category. And here I also talk about the cultural resource framework. So here an example of Hamilton City in Canada, and which is focused on the 6 areas. One is the creative cultural industries, community and cultural organizations, spaces and facilities, cultural heritage, natural heritage, festivals and events. So this is a kind of cultural resource framework which they have identified to map. And then they started looking at all these 6 categories and how the city of Hamilton has been mapped out, and the access to it, and the transportation facilities to it. And the Hamilton resource baseline mapping results, they identified how much creative cultural industries and organizations. So they listed all these things. So the one phase is about identifying and mapping that. The second phase is about how we act upon it, how we can develop strategically act upon it. And from the London perspective, the Cities Institute have developed a cultural planning toolkit. So it provides guidance and toolkits and data. In fact, I'm giving a brief about the authors who are involved in this report. So it was dated. Here I need to talk about a 6-acre standard, a dated 6-acre standard, which was earlier followed for almost more than 80 years. And it is talking about, let's say, for every 1,000 members of population, 500 were below the age of 40. And it was assumed that these 150 would either not want to play sport or would be unable to because of infirmity. And a further 150 would use school facilities. Thus 200 people would use, and 1,000 would be catered for. So basically, for this particular 1,000 population, what we need is a 1 junior football pitch, cricket pitch, and a rink, bowling green, tennis court. So it basically, these basic facilities occupies about 6 acres. And that is how this old standard has been following, and how in today's conditions, how it actually meets. That is one of the debate this report have actually started, how it is dated and how we need to look at it in the present context, what are the challenges. And the other thing, we talk about the hierarchy of arts provisions, how the neighborhood level, the local level, and the borough or regional level, and at a city regional. So how it provides access both in, and how it also becomes a production chain from a local to a city or regional level. And it has also defined certain, what is the criteria for defining strategically important arts, cultural and entertainment. So what kind of access, for instance, what is the significant proportion of its visitors? Is it from one borough or the 2 borough or from international? So basically there are a list of the strategic parameters, how one can assess the strategic importance of that places. And there are also certain national strategies that have informed the cultural planning both at local and regional level. And there are also statutory and non-statutory plans that might influence the content of local cultural strategy. For instance, in statutory, we have educational development plans, community safety strategies, land use plans, whereas in the non-statutory, we have the sustainable community strategies and the best value performance plans on a comparative note. So this gives an overall map of the kind of links of both from a regional to the local level. And in fact, this has been summarized in DCMS consultation draft, how the regional cultural consortium interacts with the local cultural strategies, and how these strategies are linked with various local authority. So like that, there's a kind of broader framework has been developed. In fact, I got some examples how they have actually mapped the, for example, if you look at the Mayor of London's website, a lot of maps have been developed based on its art forms or the cultural resources. For instance, dance facilities, then you can see which are the places you have and how, what kind of transportation links, and you can interact with those facilities. So a citizen can easily access the information. And similarly, one can understand the London's strategic cultural areas. And not only that, the nighttime economy is one of the upcoming strategies, how we can make a 24-hour London vision, you know, how the nighttime music bars and everything, how the city changes in the nighttime. So thankfully, I've got a chance to work with Professor Marianne Roberts, who have been involved in this nighttime economy work. So now you can see that how a culture is mapped and understood, and how they have been taught not just on a local level, but at a borough level and at a regional level, at a city level and a regional level. And we also discussed about the intercontinental links, and so that the goods produced from here, it can travel all through, it could be disseminated, and it could also establish a marketplace. So this is a brief introduction of cultural planning, and in the further classes we also discuss more cases on it. Thank you.